Think back to the first time you watched a Western movie. A lone rider gallops into a quiet town, pistol strapped to his side, white hat shining in the sun, ready to bring law to chaos. That image shaped the way generations imagined the Old West. But what if almost everything you think you know is just a Hollywood illusion? In this video, we're digging up 25 popular facts about the Wild West that are more fiction than history. We'll pull back the curtain on the gritty, unfiltered reality, a world that was raw, unpredictable, and far more complex than the silver screen ever showed. 1. Every cowboy had a revolver. It's one of the most replayed scenes in Westerns. A cowboy strolling through town, coat flicking in the wind, revolver hanging low on his hip, eyes scanning for trouble. But here's the truth. The classic six-shooter, it was more of a cinematic prop than a real-world necessity. Actual cowboys weren't hired guns or shootout pros. They were hard-working ranch hands, moving herds, repairing gear, sleeping under the stars. For most of them, carrying a revolver made about as much sense as carrying a frying pan on your belt. Guns were expensive, heavy, and mostly impractical during long days in the saddle. In fact, many ranch owners banned personal firearms altogether, knowing they could spark drunken fights or deadly accidents. And when cowboys did need protection, they preferred rifles or shotguns, far more useful for defending against predators or danger from a distance. Instead of holsters packed with pistols, most cowboys kept their belts loaded with tools: ropes, knives, hammers, the things a working man needed to get through a long day on the open range. Then came the movie industry. Hollywood needed tension, danger, and dramatic standoffs to keep crowds glued to the screen. So, the everyday ranch hand was transformed into a gunslinging hero, armed and always ready. Meanwhile, the real cowboys kept their heads down, boots dirty, hands blistered, with no revolver in sight. 2. Every cowboy wore a Stetson? Think again. It's an image that's practically burned into the American brain. A lone rider in a high-crowned, wide-brimmed Stetson, casting a shadow over his steely gaze. But truth is, many never wore one. And if they did, it looked nothing like the Hollywood version. The original Stetson, called the Boss of the Plains, had a round brim and a flat top. Simple, functional, designed to shield against sun and dust. Others wore bowlers, also known as derbies, large-brimmed sombreros for better sun coverage, or even old military caps left over from the Civil War. Cowboys chose their hats based on what worked, what was cheap, and what lasted, not what looked good on camera. 3. Cowboys were always clean-shaven and well-groomed? Nope. Watch enough old westerns and you'll start to believe cowboys never had a hair out of place. Clean-shaven faces, crisp shirts, and hair that somehow stayed perfect through wind, dust, and gunfire. The truth? Couldn't be more different. On long rides through harsh terrain, bathing was a luxury. Clean water was rare, and a mirror even rarer. Their days were filled with chasing cattle, setting up camp, and surviving the elements. Beards, unkempt hair, worn-out clothes, and the permanent smell of sweat were just part of the lifestyle. Many sported thick mustaches or scruffy beards, not by choice, but by necessity. Their outfits, sturdy, cheap, and repairable, nothing fancy, just whatever worked. Hollywood, however, had other plans. 4. Cowboys were all tall, muscular giants? Actually, no. We often picture them as towering figures with square jaws, broad shoulders, and backs as wide as barn doors. But step back into the real Wild West, and you'd likely be surprised. Most cowboys were on the smaller side, typically 5'5" to 5'7", and weighing less than 150 pounds. And there was a reason for it. Traveling across rugged trails, riding long distances daily, navigating rivers and mountains. It helped to be light and nimble. 5. Being a cowboy was an endless adventure, only in the movies. If your idea of cowboy life is drawn from westerns, it probably looks like one long action sequence. Gunfights, barroom laughs, dusty chases on horseback, and a woman in a window waiting as the sun sets. But the reality was far less glamorous. Cowboy life was grueling, repetitive, and exhausting. It was dawn to dusk labor under a scorching sun or freezing sky. It meant sleeping on hard ground, eating whatever was available, and going days without comfort or rest. Sure, there were rare moments of excitement, but mostly it was hard work, low pay, and isolation. Not exactly the adventure fantasy pop culture made it out to be. 6. Cowboy life was fun and full of laughs? Not quite. The truth? Life on the range was anything but cheerful. Most days started before sunrise, with cowboys saddling up and riding across miles of unforgiving terrain. Under blistering heat, sudden hailstorms started. Number 7. Cowboys and their horses were best friends? Not exactly. In movies, the cowboy and his horse are inseparable. Sleek, majestic animals that gallop side by side with their rider like lifelong companions. It looks noble and emotional, but it's mostly fiction. In the real West, most working horses didn't belong to the cowboys. They were owned by the ranch. Riders were assigned horses based on the job, not on emotional connection. When the workday ended, the horse went back to the corral like any other tool of the trade. No sunset rides, no whispered goodbyes. These horses weren't picked for beauty. They were chosen for stamina, temperament, and sure-footedness. They were smaller than the majestic breeds shown on film, but they could cover long distances over brutal landscapes. The best horses knew how to stay calm during a stampede, how to sidestep a bucking steer, and how to keep moving when exhaustion set in. That was the real bond, not love, but reliability. Number 8. The Wild West was just a land of white men? Far from it. If you go by what old westerns show, you'd think the entire frontier was built and defended solely by white men in boots and badges. But the true story of the West is far more diverse. Nearly 1 in 4 cowboys were black, many of them formerly enslaved people who found freedom and work in the open lands after the Civil War. Right alongside them were vaqueros of Mexican descent, whose cattle ranching traditions had been around long before the term cowboy even existed. These vaqueros passed down essential techniques and words still used today, like lasso, rodeo, and chaps. The West was also home to Native American tribes who lived on and defended the land, Chinese immigrants who built railroads and worked mines, and waves of European settlers chasing new beginnings. The frontier wasn't a whitewash stage. It was a multicultural, multilingual, and often chaotic blend of people all trying to survive and shape the American West. Number 9. Diverse voices were left out of the story. The real West was a blend of cultures: black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, native tribes, Chinese laborers, European settlers, and frontier women, all shaping the land together. But early storytellers, from dime novelists to Hollywood directors, chose to spotlight only one angle: the white, male cowboy. This one-dimensional version was easier to package and sell, but it erased the complexity that made the West truly fascinating. 10. Women were just background characters? Not even close. In classic Westerns, women often appear as little more than set pieces, behind the saloon bar, peeking through an upstairs window, or gasping dramatically during shootouts. But the truth is, women weren't passive bystanders in the shaping of the frontier. They were key players. Roughly 1/3 of land claims filed under the U.S. Homestead Act were submitted by women. These weren't just wives. They were widows, single mothers, and fiercely independent women carving out new lives. They ran farms, opened businesses, worked as healers, taught in rural schools, and delivered mail across snowy landscapes. Like Mary Fields, a formerly enslaved woman who became a legendary stagecoach driver and crack shot. Some, like Charlotte Parkhurst, even disguised themselves as men to take jobs off limits to women. And she famously cast a vote long before women gained the legal right to do so. Figures like Annie Oakley and Calamity Jane gained fame for their fearlessness and sharpshooting. But they weren't the only ones. They represented a whole generation of women who helped build the West from the ground up. 11. Native Americans were violent savages, a harmful myth. Few myths have done more lasting damage than the one painting Native Americans as savage, bloodthirsty aggressors. This distorted image dominated films and literature for decades. While some modern media has tried to correct this portrayal, the stereotype lingers. The truth is, Native cultures across North America were incredibly diverse. Hundreds of unique nations with distinct languages, spiritual systems, and ways of life. They were not a single group, and they certainly weren't inherently violent. When conflict occurred, it was almost always rooted in the defense of their land, broken promises, or forced removal, not unprovoked aggression. The term Indian itself was born from a navigational mistake by Columbus and stuck, inaccurately labeling millions of people. Hollywood leaned on these stereotypes for dramatic effect, reducing complex nations into a single villainous trope, erasing centuries of culture in the process. 12. The Wild West was pure lawlessness? Not really. If you've ever watched a Western, you've seen it. A dusty town where the tension is so thick one glare could trigger a gunfight. But this dramatic image doesn't reflect most frontier towns. In reality, settlers wanted peace and structure. They built homes, schools, businesses, and communities. Many towns had functioning legal systems, appointed sheriffs, posted curfews, and even required visitors to check their weapons at the edge of town. Yes, there were chaotic boomtowns, places that sprang up overnight near mines or railroad hubs, and they could get rowdy. But these were outliers, not the standard. In places without formal governance, locals often created town councils or vigilante groups to maintain safety and fairness. The violent towns became the backdrop of countless films because conflict sells. But the untold story? Quiet streets, hardworking families, and people planting the seeds of modern America. So what do you prefer, the dramatic version or the raw reality? Drop just one word in the comments, movie or reel. 13. Sheriffs were cowards or crooks, mostly fiction. Movies love the scene where a sheriff trembles behind his desk while villains run wild, until a mysterious hero rides in to clean up the mess. But in real life, sheriffs were often the opposite, calm, tough, and deeply respected. Their job was far from easy. They had to mediate land disputes, handle violent drunks, prevent fights over gambling debts. 14. Sheriffs were often controlled by gangs? Rarely. Yes, there were cases where local power players, wealthy ranchers, or criminal gangs tried to influence or intimidate the town sheriff, but that wasn't the norm. Most sheriffs weren't smooth-talking gunslingers like in the movies. They didn't deliver stirring speeches or shoot with perfect aim. 15. Vigilante justice was always noble? Not exactly. Western films often glorify vigilante groups, pitchforks in hand, torches blazing, riding out to deliver justice where the law had failed. The narrative paints them as brave citizens rising up in a lawless world. But scratch the surface, and a more troubling reality emerges. In remote frontier regions, law enforcement was slow to arrive. Without formal courts or police, communities did sometimes take justice into their own hands. At first, these groups may have acted with good intentions, to protect neighbors or deter crime. Classic gun duels happened all the time? Hardly. Few Western scenes are more iconic than two men standing face to face in the middle of a dusty street, hands twitching near their holsters as the clock chimes noon. It's cinematic gold, but historically, it's nearly pure fiction. These carefully timed one-on-one showdowns were incredibly rare. Most gun violence in the Old West had no drama, no countdown, and no honor. Violence usually erupted from heated arguments, drunken tempers, or gambling disputes. Saloon fights were massive and frequent? Not really. In movies, the saloon is where things always explode. Music playing, drinks flowing, and then boom! Chairs fly, bottles smash, and someone crashes through a window. But for the actual saloon owner, that kind of chaos was a disaster. Sure, minor fights happened, mix alcohol and gambling and tempers flare. But long, destructive brawls were rare. Broken furniture was expensive to replace. Rowdy scenes scared off paying customers. And if someone died in the scuffle, business could come to a permanent business. It's one of the most famous names in Western lore, the gunfight at the OK Corral. But here's the twist. The actual shootout didn't happen inside the corral at all. On October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona, a shootout broke out between the Earp brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Clanton-McClory gang. But the action went down in a narrow, vacant lot next to a photo studio, about half a block away from the OK Corral entrance. The whole thing lasted less than half a minute. There were no cinematic slow draws, no dramatic buildup, just a burst of gunfire, confusion, and bodies hitting the ground before anyone fully realized what was happening. The OK Corral was sharpshooting a gun clean out of someone's hand from from across the street, but reality was much less precise. The typical revolvers of the Old West were clunky, smoky, and wildly inconsistent. They fired slow-moving lead bullets using black powder, which created huge clouds of smoke with every shot, sometimes obscuring the shooter's own vision. Beyond 50 feet, hitting a specific target was often pure luck. Misfires, jams, and worn-out parts were common problems. Without regular maintenance, they could even injure the person firing them. That's why serious defenders like lawmen, ranchers, or night guards preferred rifles or shotguns. They had better aim, more range, and enough power to actually stop a threat. The flashy trick shots you see in films, splitting playing cards or shattering bottles from 100 feet, were often performed by acts or outright special effects. In real life, bullets flattened or broke apart. They didn't ricochet cleanly like they do in Hollywood. But the visuals stuck around, because nothing sells like a cool-looking hero with perfect aim. Train robberies were rampant in the West, not quite. Nothing screams Wild West louder than a gang of outlaws galloping alongside a moving train, leaping onto the roof, and pointing pistols at terrified passengers. It's a scene replayed endlessly in movies, starting with the Great Train Robbery in 1903, until it became gospel. But here's the reality. Train robberies were rare. Across roughly 4 decades, often considered the peak of the Wild West, fewer than 1,000 train robberies were documented, barely 20 to 25 per year. And many of those didn't even happen west of the Mississippi. Quite a few were small-time thefts or even inside jobs by disgruntled employees. Forget the dramatic horse-to-train leaps and dynamite-packed safes. Most real attempts were clumsy or short-lived. In fact, crimes like cattle theft, land scams, and saloon brawls were far more common, but those didn't make for thrilling theater. It was that short, silent film in 1903 that etched masked bandits and steam engines into our cultural memory. Even though the truth was far less glamorous, the image stuck. 22. Horses were the only way to travel in the West? Not entirely. Thanks to movies, it feels like every person in the West got around solely by horse. Lone riders gallop across open plains, villains thunder into town, and entire chases unfold on horseback. But history tells a more varied story. Yes, horses were essential, fast, nimble, and able to cross rough terrain. But they weren't the only means of getting around. Before railways reached the region, the stagecoach system crisscrossed the West, carrying passengers, mail, and even treasure. By the 1870s, railroads transformed everything. The 23. Gold was easy to find and made everyone rich? Far from it. We've all heard the stories. A man swings a pickaxe a few times and uncovers a nugget the size of his fist. Riches overnight. But that was the fantasy. When the California gold rush exploded in 1848, a few early arrivals did strike it big. But for the tens of thousands who followed, the experience was grueling. Prime spots were quickly claimed, and most newcomers spent endless hours panning rivers for nothing more than tiny gold flakes. Many didn't even earn enough to cover basic expenses: tools, food, or shelter. So who really made money? 24. Tumbleweed was always part of the Western landscape. Actually, it's an invader. The image is iconic. Wind sweeping across a deserted street, a lone plant tumbling by as the gun smoke settles. But the rolling tumbleweed that closes so many Western scenes, it wasn't even around during the early frontier days. Tumbleweed, technically Salsola tragus, is an invasive species from Russia. It arrived in North America in the 1870s, likely mixed in with imported flaxseed. Once it landed, it spread fast, thriving in the dry, open spaces of the plains. Early settlers never saw it. 25. Hat color revealed a character's morality? Only in the movies. In classic Westerns, the rules were simple. White hat, good guy. Black hat, bad guy. It was a visual shorthand so strong that audiences didn't need dialogue to figure out who to root for. But on the real frontier, hat choices were based on logic, not symbolism. Light-colored hats were cooler under the scorching sun. Dark hats hid dirt and wear better. Price, durability, and function mattered more than fashion. No one was judging morality by brim color. So the Wild West wasn't clean, simple, or anything like what the movies showed us. But maybe that's exactly what makes the truth even more compelling. Beneath the myths and the cinematic slow-motion showdowns were real people, gritty, flawed, and surviving in a world that demanded more toughness than charm. The reality wasn't black and white. It was chaotic, colorful, and deeply human. So now that you've seen the other side of the legend, ask yourself, which version sticks with you more, the polished fantasy or the untamed truth? Comment just one word below, movie or real. I'll be watching.